So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Anne Bahr Thompson, who is a pioneer of the Brand Citizenship movement. Hi, Anne. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Adrian?
I am splendid. Thank you very much. So, Anne, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit about you and a little bit more about the work that you do?
Well, as you mentioned, I am the pioneer of the movement of brand citizenship. It's a 5-step model I recently founded. I'm also the founder of a boutique strategic consultancy called OneSixtyFourth, and we focus on integrating cultural trends and a social conscience into brand development. Previously, I've headed up the consulting businesses at Interbrand, and I've also worked in strategic planning, research, and product management in B2B banking, in consumer goods, and a few other things here and there.
Wow. So you've had a wide and varied career. That's splendid.
Yeah, not necessarily as varied as it may seem on the onset. There definitely is a through line, but yes, and probably that through line is what has led to where we're ending up today to talk about.
Fantastic. Now, the reason why we arranged this interview is that you recently published a book called Do Good, Embracing Brand Citizenship to Fuel Both Purpose and Profit. That's exciting. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and how it came about and who's it for and what's the main headline?
Yeah, so the main headline I'll start with is that doing good is no longer has to be perceived as a cost to your business. It's actually a way to invest into your brand, your reputation, and into growing loyalty and engagement with customers, employees, and other stakeholders. The book is, if I start at the basis of who it's for, given that my background is branding and marketing, and you should start with the customer or with your audiences. The book is really for business leaders and anyone, frankly, who's interested in progressing business's role in society. And I would say the number of people that are interested in that are growing the number of people that are interested in that is growing every day. Which to me is very exciting. And why I wrote the book in part was to help accelerate that movement. The book is a result of research that happened over 3 years. And what I think is important, and we'll probably delve more into the research, so I don't want to jump ahead, but what's important to note is that my 5-step model of brand citizenship is not something I set out to create. At the end of 2011, I was doing trend research, and there was something that emerged that was surprising to me. So over the next 3 years, I granted myself money to deconstruct brand leadership from good corporate citizenship and from favorite brands, which is a proxy for brand loyalty. And from that research, from the grassroots up, from what people told us, the model emerged. So it wasn't something baked in an ivory tower in a classroom or a boardroom. It was something that actually emerged as a result of what people told us, which is why it's powerful and actually probably makes sense to most everyone who learns about it.
Perfect. Now, before we actually dive into the book and get into this model and the research and things that you found out, I agree with you that there is this rising kind of trend that's going around whether it's conscious capitalism, doing good, a greater purpose beyond profits, and all these things. Are these all part of the same movement and trend? And what's kind of behind it?
Well, I would say they are part of the same movement and trend, and I think there's probably fine lines that exist between each of these things you mentioned. Conscious capitalism has a technical definition, which we don't need to go into. Doing good is something that is about a moral and ethical code, but it's also actually, if you even look up the phrase in the dictionary, it's about contributing something. And purpose beyond profits is actually the benefit of both of those things to society, and the purpose aligned with profits, or the profit aligned with purpose, maybe it's the better way to think about it, is how this whole movement benefits companies and businesses so they have a greater incentive to go out there and do good. You said what's behind this? To me, what's behind this is the changing world we're living in. There's a number of things going on that have led to this. And I would say what's happened is the current political climate across the world, pretty much with bipartisan politics, with polarized points of view growing, has actually accelerated a nascent trend of consciousness that started around the turn of the millennium as a result of technology and the digital world we live in. When people start seeing what's going on across the globe, it's harder to ignore how what benefits you could potentially be harming other people. And I would say that's probably the beginnings of what made a movement that actually has been around since forever. Since business existed, people have debated business's responsibility in society. Sure.
So do you think that you mentioned the political kind of dimension. Is it that so people are looking for, if you like, other agents other than government and larger, more public organizations to solve some of the challenges that we're facing, whether they are, social, economic or environmental, because they are large bodies and therefore they can have an influence? Is that so? They're looking for almost a switch. They're looking for people to kind of become bigger actors in those spaces, in the face of those challenges. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, and I think, to be honest, that was the underlying sentiment that started emerging in this research I mentioned we began conducting in 2011. That combined with a series of things of the brands that people told us were good corporate citizens and why were the things that led me to go on and pursue a deeper exploration. The people were asking at the end of 2011, which was a different political climate. Sure. It was an election year in the U.S. My research was in the U.S. and the U.K. In the U.K., there was a feeling of cutbacks from the government and paring back of things. There were a lot of things going on at 2011, not nearly as polarized as it is now, although at the time we probably thought it was extremely polarized. But in that climate, and something that probably came back at us 4 years later in the last U.S. election that highlighted things combined with Brexit happening, you started hearing people asking for business to step in and progress society. They felt that politicians were just constantly faced with an opposition, the other party, and because of that, they weren't progressing things. And in their minds, business had less of an opposition, although businesses and corporations especially do have a slight opposition in that their board has to come along with them if you're a large company with a board.
Sure. And therefore, it's almost the leveraging spending power to promote kind of doing the right thing or, doing better things in many ways.
And innovation power.
Absolutely.
And the ability to solve problems. Business has to be able to move forward, innovate, and solve problems to survive. Government doesn't.
Excellent. So within these themes that came out of the research and in the book, and you've developed this brand citizenship model to help companies navigate their way towards this goal of doing good and doing better. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about this model and the sort of and the steps within it in terms of, I guess, there's a maturity of steps, or is it just a set of steps on the journey?
I would say it's a set of steps on the journey, although they do appear as a maturity. And I kept thinking of it initially as a maturity, but the more and more as I started researching and developing it, I started seeing that, and I'll get into the steps in a moment, but people in the research seem to categorize companies in one of each of these 5 steps. However, in their mind, to be a responsible citizen, to do good, to embrace the notion of brand citizenship, companies had to glide along the continuum back and forth. And I'll explain that continuum, even though they tend to be categorized in one step. So they have elements of every step in them, but they're thought of strategically in one place.
Right.
So it runs across something I call a me to we continuum, because the thing that emerged in the research that was one of the big findings, other than the sentiment that we want business to step in and transform society, was that the companies people were naming as good corporate citizens were not companies we would have identified as good corporate citizens. And the reason they were naming them as good corporate citizens all had a me proposition. So I'll give you two examples that really jump out. Number one, Apple rose by far to the top of the brands named as a good corporate citizen. And whilst we expected Apple to be named as a leadership brand, we did not expect it to be named as a good corporate citizen, especially at the end of 2011, because media activists and a variety of other people were lambasting it because of its supplier relationships and issues with chips.
Especially the thing around Foxconn, I think it was.
Yes. I believe it was Foxconn in 2011, although I might have my date slightly off as well. But yeah, so it was sort of like, wait a minute, how could you be naming Apple as the number one good corporate citizen? And when you read their responses as to why, because we asked people to tell us why, and we did not have these answers coded. We did not have someone in a back room who didn't know why we were doing the research turn people's answers into 3 words that take away some of the color and beauty of them, which is often what happens in research. We read through all this, and the reason people named Apple as a good corporate citizen was because Apple transforms the way I communicate with people across the globe. Apple's brought joy into my life by giving me music 24/7. It was all this huge me proposition.
Right.
And that was really surprising. It was like, wait a minute, corporate citizenship is about we, it's not about me. And then the other brands that they named, and I'll put them on a parallel, were Walmart in the US and Tesco in the UK.
Right.
And they were each named because people said because of their pricing, they afford me a better lifestyle. And I was like, hang on a minute, what does that have to do with corporate citizenship? So this notion that corporate citizenship begins with me was huge. And that's what led us to go on and led me to commission amongst myself and my firm, this deconstruction of leadership from citizenship and loyalty. And so the steps that emerged as you go along, the first one is trust. And trust is do what you say. So trust is the basics. It is the beginning. And if you think about it, trust is the starting point for any loyal, meaningful relationship you have with people. So why shouldn't it be the starting point for any loyal, meaningful relationship you have with a brand or with a company? And historically, trust has been the end game for advertisers, for people in reputation management. So the notion that it starts with trust is a new sort of way of looking at it. It's almost turning the notion of how you build loyalty upside down. Loyalty doesn't end with trust, it begins with trust.
Right.
So you move from trust to this notion of enrichment. And enrichment is bettering my life. It's making every day more inspired in the same way people said Apple brought joy into their life. And Apple is a brand people do tend to categorize at step 2 of enrichment. Some of the other brands people put in that place was one of the brands people named is a company called Mrs. Meyer's, which does household cleaning products in the U.S.
Right.
And they have natural ingredients. They're not 100% natural, but they're relatively natural. And they're honest about it, so they're upfront. And people would tell us, oh, when I use Mrs. Meyer's, I feel like I'm cleaning in a French lavender field, and it makes cleaning so much easier and a more joyful experience. So enrichment really is this way of changing how I do an everyday routine. IKEA was another company named in there. It enriches our homes. Company Plum Organics that does baby food. So you can start seeing how these companies, brands that people put into enrichment are brands that sort of, they make a routine easier, but they also just make it, it's like, okay, I'm doing this now rather than, oh gosh, here I have to go. I have to feed the baby food and they're going to spit it all out. And it's not really nutritious rather than, here's a really great tasting, healthy, highly nutritious food I'm going to give my child. And if I were to cook food, it would have been like this. So enrichment is this sense of what you're doing for yourself. Then you move on to responsibility, and responsibility is the pivot point between being a me and a we brand. And responsibility has all the notions of typical corporate social responsibility and sustainability. But most importantly, people told us over and over, I don't care if you're fixing your supply chain, I don't care if a company is bettering the environment. if it's not treating its employees well and fairly first.
Right.
So a company like Walmart, for example, that is doing amazing things in supply chain and sustainability will not get credit for it unless people start thinking it's treating its employees better. Tesco, that I mentioned, was another brand that people said, made my life better by affordable pricing. And people trust Tesco to do that, but they don't trust Tesco to necessarily pay employees fairly either. There's now a big lawsuit about equal pay for women versus men in comparable jobs. So you start seeing how responsibility is this pivot point between me and we, but responsibility as the pivot point begins with people rather than bettering other things.
Right.
So then you move from responsibility to community. And community is about connecting people through shared values. And it's very easy to think of community in the sense of digital communities and social media, but community is about a lot more. One way some companies build community is through community initiatives where they bring customers and employees together. Mrs. Myers does that. Burt's Bees is another brand that does that. Innocent Drinks in the UK has done that for many years. Mm-hmm. And other ways people do community is in 2004, for example, before Facebook existed, IBM created a values jam where their employees across the whole world, across the globe, spent 3 days having the opportunity to contribute to developing IBM's revitalized values. They were allowed to say what makes an IBM or an IBM, or what's wrong with IBM today? How do we make it right? What do we value? So they brought their employees together and created a greater sense of community across IBM, which had been made prior to that financially stronger, but lost a lot of its cultural heritage. Forest Stewardship Council is another example of community, and that's a B2B community. So Forest Stewardship Council brings together businesses that all care about preserving the forest. And they have standards for these businesses, but they also allow the businesses to learn from one another. So community is much greater than the notion of a digital community. And then you move to contribution, and contribution is through my association with you, through my being your customer or your vendor or your employee, make me bigger than I am, make my contribution to bettering the world more than it would be otherwise. And contribution is where most socially conscious brands sit, a brand like Warby Parker, the one-for-one model brands.
Sure.
But regular brands, normal companies can fit under contribution also. Lush is handmade cosmetics in the UK, and they're thought of a brand, according to the people we spoke to, as a brand that's all about contribution. And Lush is actually the result of its founder's long journey to create a company that had sustainability embedded in its core and activism in a really accessible, not angry way at its core as well. Kenco Coffee is another brand that people spoke about as contributing. And Kenco has an initiative called Coffee and Gangs. And what that does is donate money, and it funds through an NGO the training of teenagers in Honduras to become coffee farmers. And why is that really important? Because in Honduras, when teenagers hit a certain age, they only have 3 choices in life. And Honduras is the number 1 or number 2 murder capital every year in the world. And the 3 choices these teenagers have are join a gang, leave the country, or be killed. And so Kenco has given them a 4th choice now. You can learn to be a coffee grower, a coffee farmer. And whilst they only can impact, 30 or 50 teenagers a year, each year it builds on each other. And also in the book, for example, I pontificate. Imagine if they created a consortium among all the different coffee manufacturers, coffee producers, and they all got together and worked with NGOs to expand this program across South America, for example, where the situation or other situations of teenagers in poverty needing to be educated and find a way to move forward exist. They could actually change a continent together if they brought this idea out further. Yeah. So that's the 5 steps.
And so, because it seemed to me that I was just listening to you there, and it seems like it's almost like the 5 steps, but they almost, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like they almost like they organize into possibly three concentric rings in many ways. Almost the first two is about sort of me, on that kind of related to the me to we continuum we talked about. There's like me, and then it moves on to it's almost people that are close to me or kind of in my immediate vicinity and around the community, or kind of the employees of the companies that I engage with. And then there's the broadest kind of ring is more around, as you say, contribution to a broader society, or broader economic or broader environmental kind of challenges. Would that be accurate?
That's completely accurate. And to be honest, if anyone sees any of the original articles I wrote on leadership and citizenship when I first started investigating this early on in the research, that is how I was depicting a lot of it. We thought it was very much about moving from close in to far out. And then as we deconstructed it further, we learned there are actually these very distinctive elements.
Yeah. Okay.
That build toward that. But yes, you're 100% correct in how you've pictured it.
And so this it also kind of feels like that there are some these different steps at like 1 through 5. It's not does it necessarily hold that a firm would have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 and then 5, or they could appear on at different. They could maybe just naturally appear at one sort of step and then expand into the other ones.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I started. Is you tend to be strategically your business proposition, which sort of becomes, or not sort of, your business proposition is the root of how you define your larger purpose as a business. Your raison d'être has to be tied to your value proposition, and that does tend to put you at one of those steps. However, in order to fulfill people's desire for you to span across a me to we continuum, you have to glide back and forth. But it offers flexibility in starting to learn to implement the whole notion of doing good, because you can start at any point. You can start on what you're best at.
Yeah, no,
and then move back and forth, and you know, you don't have to build from each other. Things have to be connected through a higher purpose and your value proposition. But as long as you do that, you have flexibility to move. It's not a checklist model. It's not do this, do that, do the other thing. It's very much about an individual journey and an individual pathway for a company. And also because there are no fixed business models right now out there for this new way of working. It's integrative. It's about breaking down silos. You have to experiment, and you have to be willing to accept measured risk, which means sometimes you'll discover things haven't actually worked.
Sure.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Because you move on and you figure out a better way to do it.
But this is actually, there might be some people that listen to this and going, this is like CSR plus, right? And let's kind of clear this up from the get-go. This is not a CSR initiative. This is way, way more than that. This is like a fundamentally reassessing your place in the world as a business, and how you connect with your customers and your employees and suppliers and the world necessarily to doing bigger and better kind of things.
I'd wholly agree, and I like to think of it as an integrative ethos that permeates a company and everything it does. CSR, in the way it's been conceived, in the way people think of it, is a department.
Yes.
It's not an ethos. And even if a company offers corporate sustainability opportunities across different functions, now people tend to have a social mission that leads to community volunteerism that they think of as a way to engage employees. And sometimes that is connected with CSR. But still, those things are individual initiatives. They're not an ethos that permeates based upon your purpose. And brand citizenship is an ethos that permeates, that begins with really understanding what your higher order purpose is. And most importantly, because you are a business, you are not a nonprofit or a charity or an NGO, that purpose isn't rooted only in doing good. It's rooted in what your business is about and how that can expand outward, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, but this is a change for many businesses. I mean, so what are the sort of things that businesses are going to have to, I guess, get over, or to start kind of following this sort of path? I mean, what are sort of some of the main barriers to adoption of this type of approach?
Well, the main barriers of adoption are not having courage to step up and step out. I think it does require bravery. Mm-hmm. And whereas I said, people told us that politicians had an opposing force. They had another party that ran against them. I mentioned that businesses do have an opposing force. They have their board.
Right.
So sometimes a board and what a board's demanding in terms of returns, if they're still focused on short-term returns, can be a barrier. However, even investors and large investors like BlackRock and Larry Fink are now calling for long-termism and corporate social responsibility to be more ingrained. So hopefully the investor and the board barrier will fade. And then it's about getting people comfortable with not working in a silo anymore.
Sure.
It's much easier to sit in your functional silo than partner with people in a department that you don't really understand what they do. Mm-hmm. So that notion of creating an ethos of trust, if you want to talk about beginning in step one is trust, actually one of the most important steps is starting to create an ethos of trust amongst and between employees and management. That also helps.
Right.
So the barriers are really about, some barriers people would say have been barriers for other things in progress and innovation and risk-taking. They're not unique necessarily, but they can be harder to overcome because you may not initially, out of the box, be able to tie some of these initiatives to increase profits. But over time, as loyalty grows, as loyalty both amongst customers and importantly employees, because today's businesses are losing a lot of money with employee turnover,
sure,
retraining, and to have your employees feel more inspired and understand that they're actually at work for something more than a paycheck.
Yeah.
That could actually be a really positive outcome and one of the greatest drivers to surpass some things like your board, like your investors.
I mean, and are those the things like reducing employee turnover, increasing customer loyalty? Are those some of the main metrics around that help build the business case for the adoption of this type of approach?
Out of the box, in a larger scale, yes. However, companies who have this type of approach have seen increases in sales. In the book, I talk about Vaseline, which is a product that Unilever has, and Vaseline has a healing initiative that when they've done when they've associated the product and during the time they advertise their program, sales have increased and repeat purchases have increased. And I give some of those numbers, the numbers I was allowed to reveal in the book. Mm-hmm. Andrex toilet tissue is another brand that has had that same sort of result. When Andrex had special packs that went toward treating hygiene in Angola. And right. You can see how Vaseline had an initiative that was related to healing the body and the skin. Mm-hmm. So it's related to what Vaseline is about. Andrex had an initiative that had to do with hygiene and water and betterment of toiletry in Angola, which is related to Andrex toilet tissue. So you start seeing how it's related to their business proposition. Andrex, which is the #1 toilet tissue brand in the UK, had an increase in sales. Right. So the #1 brand had a lift in sales when it did this. So when you look at it as a smaller one-off product, you can start seeing how the sales initially come out. When you think of it in terms of a company, loyalty is probably the first easiest part of the business case, although over time, clearly, profits increase as well.
Perfect. And you've mentioned a broad range of brands that feature and that came out of your research, but also kind of some of the things that some people are doing. But I mean, are there a couple that you think, actually, you know what? I really like them. I really like what they're doing. I think they're getting it right. They're sort of leading the pack. They're possibly not one of the usual suspects, but I think what they're doing, they're doing great stuff. I mean, do a couple of brands occur to you offhand that sort of fit that type of description?
There's no one that stands out as over and above anyone else because I think everybody's doing it in their own way.
Right.
All the brands I highlight in the book, actually at one point my editor said, these all must be your clients. You're so in love with them. Well, frankly, none of them are my clients. IBM was a client, but that was back in like 2001, 2002, 2003, so way before
Yeah.
I wrote the book. If I give complete transparency there, but none of these brands are my clients. I know people at most of these brands, but these brands that I highlighted came from my research.
Right.
And that's what's so exciting. And when I was told, well, you're too in love with these companies on the first pass, I was like, well, I fell in love with them more and more as I researched them because of what people told me about them.
Sure.
So I think, I have personal favorites, but I don't think they're necessarily relevant because we each have personal favorites. I think what we need to start doing is we all need to start cheering on companies when they're doing things well. We're really good at pointing out what companies do wrong, but we're less good about cheering companies that are doing good things as one-offs. Even though this isn't about one-offs, but when they try something new and they get it right, we're less good at cheering them on. And I think one of the things that came across to me is this notion of me to we has to be also about we, and it has to be about us all doing this together.
Yeah.
When I sent letters out and emails out to CEOs to interview people for the book, I had a lot of CEOs, and I talk about this, I think, in the chapter on responsibility, which I think is chapter 6, if I remember, which I do remember correctly. It is chapter 6. In chapter 6, I talk a little bit about this, but it's interesting. I had responses from almost every company I sent letters to. I had one or two responses which surprised me, and I'm not going to reveal which brands they were, but brands that I thought were really good. And some of them thought it was a pay-to-play model. And when they learned it wasn't a pay-to-play model, they didn't want to play anymore, which really shocked me. I stepped back for a moment. Here I thought the fact that it was real empirical research was the driver. And it turned out some people wanted to control their story.
Wow.
And when they couldn't, and again, I won't reveal them, when they couldn't, I became a little cynical about their doing good. But most of the businesses did get back to me, and a large number of CEOs got back to me and said, this is great. We're really excited you identified us as an exemplar. However, I'm not going to talk to you on record, and you can't use us. And the reason they didn't want to be used as an exemplar of one of the steps is because they were frightened if they were named as someone doing good in some way, activists would start searching out what they weren't doing.
Right.
Good. And the problem is businesses are in a transition and they can't change everything in one day, even though we would love them to. It's unrealistic.
Sure.
So that notion that we're always looking to catch people out is what drives us. And I think in some ways, it potentially might limit the information we as purchasers of goods and services get from companies. And wouldn't it be great to know more about what a company's doing that makes it right? We might change who we buy every day. And each time you do that, you set the bar higher and more people jump along the pathway. So I think we need to start thinking more and rewarding people more for the things they are changing that's positive, not always looking at what's bad. That's not to say if someone's being really irresponsible, they shouldn't be caught out, because they should.
Sure.
But we need to focus on good a little bit more than we do, I think.
I'd like to think so. I mean, I recently completed an interview with a gentleman by the name of Lord Mark Price, who used to be the managing director of Waitrose and the deputy chairman of the John Lewis Partnership. And he was telling me all about the John Lewis Partnership and their model, and how it was converted from a standard private firm into when the whole firm was put in trust for their employees, effectively what they call their partners,
right.
and about how they go about their model. And I think it's just inspiring and enlightening and educating to listen to all these stories. And that's one of the reasons I conduct these interviews, is to try and shed some light on some of these stories, not just about companies that are doing good, but that companies are doing good things for both their customers and their employees. And so I applaud the work that you're doing, Kinnear, and sharing these stories. I think it's good stuff. And so I'm on your side.
Well, that's good to hear. And I should say, I actually talk about John Lewis in chapter 6 on responsibility. And what was interesting when I first started doing my research having lived in the UK for many years, having dual citizenship, I was really surprised that John Lewis or Waitrose didn't come up and rise to the surface in the UK, that Tesco came up over them when I asked about good corporate citizens.
Yeah.
And when we pursued that a little further, because it did come up by but just one or two people here or there, and it was shocking to me.
Yeah.
And what it comes down to is a company like John Lewis has had this in its ethos since the beginning.
Yeah.
And in many ways, people just expect it of it.
Yes.
So they don't necessarily identify it as a good corporate citizen because John Lewis is part of the fabric of Britain in many ways, and people just expect it to behave that way. I think if it behaved horribly, it would instantly lose public trust, and it would probably be hard to regain. And John Lewis was such a wonderful company to be able to highlight, to talk to their, whether it's them or Waitrose, they've been from the beginning treating their employees well and caring about their customers. And I won't give the anecdote now, but I talk a little bit about my first experience. I lived down the block from Peter Jones, which is a John Lewis company for people who don't know. And I highlight a little bit of a funny first experience I had with them, and I was taken aback. And I'll leave the story for people to discover in the book because it's a fun story. And it really, as someone who had just moved to a country, but someone who had spent a lot of time in the UK, I had a really funny encounter that threw me off. And I was like, what's wrong with these people? Why are they sending me to another store? And the story is deeper than that. So it's good fun. And I think they really are an amazing example that people sometimes forget are a good corporate citizen because they just expect it of them.
Absolutely. So let me kind of tell you very quickly something I learned when I spoke to Mark in my interview with him, is that did you know that John Spedden Lewis, who is the person who created the partnership initially, he wrote a constitution for the business.
Yes.
And as part of the constitution that he wrote, and which was first done in, I think, around about the 1920s, in the constitution it said, "Thou shalt not do any marketing."
Oh, that part I didn't know. That's interesting.
So effectively, they said they've been running their business saying we won't market. We're not allowed to market ourselves because we believe if we serve our customers well enough and treat our people well enough, people will talk about it, and then things will take care of themselves. And that held for about over 70 years, I think, up until the 1990s. When Mark Price actually joined, I think, the board as marketing director and actually had to change the constitution because they felt they were getting drowned out by the competition and they needed to start talking about themselves to the market so then people would actually start to become more aware of their strengths and what they were all about. So I think it's an interesting
Yeah, that's
thing.
funny.
And so they're not pure marketeers. It's something I think they're probably still learning to do as a business and as a culture, even though it's been for over 20 years.
That's really interesting, and I didn't know that. And I even spoke with Peter Cox, who's written the history of the John Lewis partnership, and I don't recall that coming up. It reminds me a little bit about IKEA, and IKEA's founder, as you may know, recently passed away.
Indeed.
And he wrote something called Testament of a Furniture Dealer. And that is like the IKEA Bible.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting, easy to read manifesto that you can find online. And I highlight one or two sentences out of there. But he really was about, in the same way John Lewis was about its employees and doing things correctly for customers to get them to build into loyalty, which is great because as a brand strategist, I used to say to people, we can do a strap line or a tagline, depending upon which country you're in. But the reality is people should just perceive it from you. You shouldn't have to tell them.
Sure.
You shouldn't have to force and superimpose what you are on people through that. They should feel it based upon every interaction they have with you. And IKEA's purpose was to create a better life for the people. And the thing that's amazing about IKEA is every time they get something wrong and they're alerted to it, they go out there and they figure out how to fix it. And it can take innovation. I tell a story about glue and particle board, and through not having an answer ready-made, IKEA developed an answer to create glue that didn't have formaldehyde in it and transform the furniture industry. So this notion to create a better life for the people extended across everything they did. And both John Lewis and IKEA are really great examples of brand citizenship. IKEA's one identified by people under enrichment, and John Lewis was one identified by the people in my research under responsibility. So you can start seeing how companies that have similar ethoses expressed in their own individual way and culture actually fit in different steps across the model.
Absolutely. So, and if execs or leaders are listening to this podcast and they're thinking, or they're reading the highlights and they're thinking about, we're starting to see this and starting to feel it from within ourselves, our people, our customers, and they sort of want to get started on their own journey. They want to kind of get started on their own path to doing good. Where would you advise that they start? What's the first thing they should be thinking about?
Well, if I advise people, I do tell them they really should identify their purpose, because clarity of understanding your higher raison d'être is really important. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, that's always been part of how brand strategists, brand consultants have approached corporate identity and developing a brand. It hasn't ever begun with advertising. Mm-hmm. That's a different element of it. So that would be where I would say to start. However, for some people that's hard and it can be a longer exercise, because especially in doing that, you should try to bring your employees and other people into the creation of it if you don't know what your higher raison d'être is. And I shouldn't say the creation of it. I think it's typically more the uncovering of it, because It's usually there. But I think really starting requires, first of all, the decision to align purpose and profit, the decision and waking up to change. Mm-hmm. And asking others ways. There's probably easy fixes right out of the box if you start working with people across your company and don't make it a top-down initiative. And I think that's actually important, not to be a pure top-down initiative, to have this something that's top-down and grassroots up. There's no set formulas, as I said, or an elixir. Mm-hmm. And I think it's about stepping back and viewing your company from a new perspective and acknowledging it's not going to happen overnight. There's no quick fixes, but you may find some quick wins. The large consumer goods companies tend to identify their billion-dollar brands, and they tell the managers of those brands, whether it's an Andrex, a Vaseline, or something else, figure out what your purpose is, and let's figure out a way to bring that in a social mission, bring a social mission into your business. And social mission is often an easy way to start. But make sure to tie your social mission to what you're about. Sure. Don't have it be just a favorite pet charity. Because to be honest, that might be nice, but it won't align purpose and profit ultimately.
Excellent. And so, Anne, before I ask you my final question that I always end these interviews on, is there anything that you think that we've missed out that you'd like to highlight before I ask you my famous last question?
Oh, I'm curious to know what that famous question is. But I think the one thing I would like to highlight again is that this is a journey, and you don't get it right out of the box. And importantly, as the things society demands of business, as our culture shifts, and as businesses themselves start to deliver good, each day the bar will be raised. And so because of that, it's something that's never complete. Mm-hmm. It's a pathway you step on, and hopefully you don't step off. But the pathway may have twists and turns, but you have to accept you will never be complete in this journey. It will continually progress and move forward as businesses do better and as people demand more of business. Perfect.
So that brings me to my final question. I call it famous. It's famous in my own lunchtime, I guess.
Okay.
I've done over 250 of these interviews, and I keep asking people this, and the question is this, Anne: is there anything that you'd like to shamelessly plug?
Oh, well, shamelessly, I plug, if you want to learn more, buy my book, Do Good. But really what I'd love to do is work with more companies and help them identify their purpose and actualize the 5 steps of brand citizenship. And I'm happy to speak to anyone and just educate you more about this. Come to a training for your teams. I want to see this movement accelerate. And I want to work in partnership with businesses, with other people working on similar initiatives. to help us together, to help us as a community create a greater contribution and better the world.
Fantastic. And first of all, I just want to say congratulations on the book and for promoting this this trend, this movement, and giving people some great signposts along how to navigate their way along their own journey. And just wanted to say thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today. That's been great.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.